I stepped outside just after sunrise and my boat was gone. 11 years beside my driveway. 30 feet of faded gray fiberglass. Old Navy scars still visible beneath 3 coats of marine paint. And all that remained was a crushed strip of grass. 2 black tire marks. And a deep metal scrape across the concrete pad. The woman who had threatened me 3 weeks earlier had finally done exactly what she promised. Except she had no idea the boat she treated like neighborhood trash was still tied to a federal preservation program. And federal people tend to take missing property personally. My name is Daniel Mercer, though most people around Cedar Ridge called me Chief because I spent 19 years in the Navy before a wrecked shoulder and a stack of paperwork convinced Uncle Sam I had done enough. I was 57 when this happened, divorced on friendly terms, father of 1 grown daughter, owner of a stubborn Labrador named Boone, and the kind of man who believed a quiet morning should involve coffee, weather, and nothing that required a lawyer. I had moved to Cedar Ridge Estates outside Ashford, North Carolina because it was calm, affordable, and close enough to the coast that I could smell salt in the air when a storm rolled inland. The boat was a 1989 Guardian Harbor Patrol craft, 29 feet long, built heavy, ugly, and nearly impossible to kill. She had once served under a Navy port security contract, hauling crews and equipment around military docks before being retired and transferred through a maritime heritage program. By the time I found her, she was sitting behind a government surplus warehouse with a seized engine and enough bird nests in the cabin to qualify as protected habitat. I bought her through a legal transfer, then spent 4 years bringing her back one system at a time. I rewired every circuit, rebuilt both fuel tanks, replaced the transom core, and learned more about old diesel engines than any sane person should. There were nights I fell asleep in the cockpit with a wrench in my hand and woke up at 2 in the morning smelling like fuel, fiberglass dust, and bad decisions. To strangers, she was an old military-looking boat. To me, she was proof that something beaten up could still be useful if somebody cared enough to stay with it. I kept her on a trailer beside my driveway, behind a 6-foot cedar fence on 2 sides, exactly where the neighborhood covenanters allowed recreational equipment to be stored. The rule was plain enough that a middle schooler could understand it. But then Vanessa Crowell moved in. Vanessa was 61, recently retired from the county planning department, and possessed the dangerous confidence of someone who had spent 30 years telling other people which forms they had filled out incorrectly. She bought the largest house at the entrance to the neighborhood, planted white roses in straight military rows, and within 10 months became president of the Homeowners Association after winning an election attended by 12 people. Vanessa loved authority the way some people love gardening. She watered it, trimmed it, displayed it proudly, and got irritated whenever anyone reminded her it had boundaries. The first time she came to my house, I had just finished changing the oil in the boat, so I was standing in the driveway with black grease up both forearms and Boone asleep under the trailer. Vanessa stopped at the edge of the pad in cream-colored slacks and shoes that had never touched honest dirt. She looked at the boat the way a restaurant owner looks at a rat. "That thing is damaging the visual character of the community," she said. I wiped my hands on a rag and asked which rule I was violating. She blinked once, not because she did not hear me, but because she was not used to being asked for evidence. "Property values are affected by perception, Mr. Mercer." That was not an answer, so I asked again. She tightened her grip on the clipboard and told me the board was reviewing storage standards. I pointed to the cedar fence, reminded her that the boat had been approved when I moved in, and offered to show her the original letter. She gave me a thin smile. "Old approvals do not prevent modern enforcement," I said. "They usually do when they are written into the covenanters." That smile disappeared. 3 weeks later, I received a violation notice claiming the boat exceeded a newly adopted equipment footprint limit. The letter gave me 20 days to remove it or face daily fines. I read it twice at my kitchen table, then called my neighbor, Owen Pike, a retired building inspector who had lived across the street since the neighborhood was built. Owen came over wearing bedroom slippers and carrying a copy of the bylaws under his arm. He read the notice, laughed once, then said, "She tried to pass that amendment last month." There were only 3 board members in the room. I asked whether it had passed. He shrugged. "Vanessa said it did. The bylaws required 5 members for a quorum. 3 people could discuss the weather, order pizza, or play cards, but they could not legally rewrite enforcement rules." I sent the board a certified letter explaining that my boat was protected under the original covenanters, and that any amendment passed without a quorum was invalid. I included the old approval, photographs from every year since I had moved in, and the transfer documents showing the boat's historical status. Vanessa never replied. She came to my porch instead. It was late afternoon, hot enough that the porch boards were warm through my socks. She stood at the bottom step and said, "You seem determined to make this difficult." I told her I had answered in writing. She said, "The neighborhood will not be held hostage by one resident's sentimental attachment to an eyesore." I remember looking at her then and realizing that Bo was not the real problem. I told her no, calmly and publicly, and people like Vanessa rarely forgive being denied without a fight. I said, "You do whatever you believe you have authority to do, but make sure you actually have it." Her face changed slightly, just enough to show I had touched the nerve. She turned around and said over her shoulder, "You may regret that tone." 3 mornings later, the boat was gone. I stood there holding a coffee mug, trying to understand the empty space where nearly 7 tons of machinery had been the night before. For a few seconds, my mind did something ridiculous and hopeful. Maybe Owen had moved it to make room for a delivery. Maybe I had forgotten something. Maybe a boat could somehow vanish without being stolen. Then I saw the gouge in the concrete and the broken edge of the grass, and the truth settled in slowly, cold and heavy. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line. No impound had been reported. I called every towing outfit within 40 miles until a dispatcher at Falcon Ridge Recovery went quiet after I gave her the trailer number. "We may have something matching that description," she said. "Watered the tow." Another pause. Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. I asked for the authorization record, the storage location, and the time they notified law enforcement. She said someone would call me back. Nobody did. I did not walk to Vanessa's house. I did not yell in the street. I went inside, made another cup of coffee, opened a fresh notebook, and began writing down times, names, tire measurements, damage, and every word I could remember. By noon, I had photographed the entire pad, saved my security camera footage, and confirmed that the tow truck had entered my property at 2:17 in the morning. 2 days later, a letter arrived from Vanessa demanding that I admit the boat violated community standards and pay a $400 remediation charge before the HOA would authorize its release. I read the letter once, placed it on the table, and called Owen. He listened quietly, then said, "Daniel, there was no board vote. She did this herself." That was the moment the anger finally arrived. Not hot and wild, but clean, focused, almost peaceful. Vanessa had not just taken my boat. She had used the title like a weapon, spent community money without permission, and expected me to pay for the privilege of surrendering. I opened the old steel file box where I kept the vessel transfer records, found the federal program contact number, and made the phone call that would turn a petty neighborhood power play into something Vanessa Crowell could no longer control. The woman who answered at the Federal Maritime Heritage Office had the calm, careful voice of somebody who had learned never to react before she had all the numbers. She asked for the vessel identification, the transfer certificate, the preservation agreement in the last known location. Then she asked me to repeat one part. Who authorized the removal? Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. I said, "From your private property?" "Yes, ma'am." "Without your consent?" "Yes, ma'am." There was a pause, not a dramatic one, just the kind where somebody on the other end has stopped typing because the situation has become more interesting than the form in front of them. She told me to email everything immediately and not to sign any release, waiver, violation acknowledgement, or retrieval agreement until their legal office reviewed it. Then she said something that settled into the room like a steel weight. "Mr. Mercer, this vessel was transferred to you under a conditional historical preservation covenant. You are the lawful custodian, but the government retains an oversight interest in its disposition. A private association cannot simply relocate it and hold it for payment without triggering questions." "Questions," I said. "Yes, sir. Several." I hung up and looked at Boone, who was sitting beside the kitchen table with his head tilted as though he had followed every word. "Well," I told him, "apparently Vanessa has made herself federally interesting." Boone sneezed and walked away, which was probably the correct legal analysis. That afternoon, I called a maritime attorney in Wilmington named Malcolm Wren. Malcolm had spent 15 years representing commercial vessel owners, shipyards, and one unfortunate man whose yacht had been seized during a divorce and accidentally sold twice. He listened without interrupting while I explained the HOA notice, the overnight tow, the federal transfer covenant, and Vanessa's demand for $400. When I finished, he said, "Did she have a court order?" "No." "Law enforcement authorization?" "No." "A board vote?" "Apparently not." Malcolm breathed out slowly. "Daniel, most bad legal decisions begin when a person mistakes possession for authority. Your HOA president appears to have done that with unusual enthusiasm. He asked me to send him every document I had, then warned me not to retrieve the boat on my own, even if the towing company suddenly offered to release it. The moment I accepted their terms, signed their paperwork, or paid their fees, Vanessa could argue I had acknowledged the enforcement process. So I waited, which is harder than it sounds when something you rebuilt with your own hands is sitting behind a chain-link fence 26 miles away. The next morning, Owen came over carrying a yellow legal pad and 2 travel mugs. He had spent the previous evening calling neighbors, not to gossip, though Cedar Ridge could turn a loose gutter into a 3-day investigation, but to find out whether Vanessa had done this before. She had. Marlene Ruiz on Hawthorne Court had been fined for a wheelchair ramp because the railings were not painted, one of the approved earth tones. The ramp had been installed for her husband after a stroke and approved by the previous board. Harold Kemp, an 80-year-old widower, had received 6 violation letters over a handmade birdhouse his late wife had painted. A young couple named Jason and Naomi Bell had been threatened with foreclosure proceedings over $300 in disputed landscaping fines. None of those people had challenged Vanessa beyond a few angry emails because most homeowners hear the word attorney and imagine their savings account catching fire. Vanessa understood that fear and used it like a fence. Owen tapped the legal pad and said, "This was never about your boat. I knew that already." But hearing him say it made the pattern visible. Vanessa had built her power from small surrenders, one resident deciding the fight was not worth it, then another, until she started believing resistance itself was misconduct. Owen had also checked the board records. The amendment Vanessa cited had been discussed at a Tuesday meeting attended by only 3 of 7 directors. The secretary had written no quorum in the margin of the draft minutes. Vanessa had later circulated a cleaned-up version with that notation missing. Owen had saved both copies because retired inspectors apparently collect questionable paperwork the way other men collect baseball cards. I called Malcolm. He became very quiet when I told him about the 2 versions. "Send both," he said. "Do not annotate them. Do not alter the file names. Just send them exactly as received." By Friday, Malcolm had issued preservation notices to Vanessa, the HOA management company, and Falcon Ridge Recovery, demanding that they retain all emails, phone records, invoices, camera footage, meeting minutes, and payment documents connected to the tow. He also sent a formal demand for the boat's immediate release without fees or conditions. Vanessa responded through email before sunset. She wrote that the association rejected my inflammatory characterization of a routine community enforcement measure and that continued escalation could result in additional sanctions. Malcolm forwarded it to me with only 4 words. She should stop writing. She did not stop writing. That weekend, Vanessa posted a message on the Cedar Ridge Neighborhood Forum titled, "Protecting Our Shared Investment." She described an abandoned industrial watercraft stored for years in open view, claimed the board had received repeated safety complaints, and suggested the owner had refused multiple good-faith opportunities to comply. She did not use my name, but she included a photograph of my driveway with the house number visible. The comments began politely, then divided the neighborhood in half by lunchtime. A few people thanked her for maintaining standards. Others asked why a boat that had sat there for 11 years had suddenly become an emergency at 2 in the morning. Marlene Ruiz posted a photograph of her husband's ramp and asked whether disabled residents were also considered threats to shared investment. Harold Kemp wrote, "My birdhouse has not yet attacked anyone, but I remain vigilant." That one got 47 likes. Vanessa deleted both comments. Owen had already taken screenshots. By Sunday evening, a new anonymous account called Cedar Resident Truth began accusing me of intimidation, aggression, and exploiting my military background to avoid community rules. The language sounded strangely similar to Vanessa's violation notices, right down to the phrase pattern of hostile non-compliance. I wanted to answer. I had a response written in my head, sharp enough to draw blood and clever enough to make me feel good for 10 minutes. Instead, I closed the app and took Boone for a walk. Anger is useful when it tells you where the injury is, but it becomes expensive when you let somebody else choose where you spend it. On Monday, Falcon Ridge Recovery's owner called me. His name was Rick Danner, and he sounded like a man who had recently received letters from several attorneys and was reconsidering every choice that had led him to that morning. He said Vanessa had represented herself as having full legal authority to remove the vessel under the HOA's governing documents. I asked whether he had verified that authority. He said his dispatcher had received a signed removal order on association letterhead. "Did you notify the sheriff?" I asked. A long silence followed. "We are reviewing our procedures," he said. That meant no. "Did you inspect the federal documentation numbers on the hull?" Another silence. "Mr. Mercer, I think it would be best if our lawyers handled this." I agreed. Before hanging up, Rick told me the boat was secure and had not been damaged as far as he knew. That phrase, "as far as he knew," stayed with me all day. I pictured the hull sitting under open weather, the trailer chained near a row of wrecked sedans, strangers climbing aboard, rain blowing through the cabin vents. I had spent years restoring that boat after its first life ended, and now I was being told to trust people who had stolen it carefully. That evening, the Federal Maritime Heritage Office called back. Their attorney had reviewed the transfer covenant and contacted the Coast Guard Documentation Branch. Because the vessel remained listed in a federal historical registry and carried original Navy service records, they were opening a formal custodial inquiry. The attorney was careful to explain that the government did not own the boat outright and that no federal crime had yet been determined. Still, the unauthorized seizure and conditional release demand created concerns about improper interference with a federally monitored historical asset. 2 representatives would visit Falcon Ridge Recovery the following week to inspect the vessel and review the removal documents. They also intended to speak with the person who authorized the tow. I thanked her, hung up, and sat alone at the kitchen table while the late sun stretched across the floor. I should have felt victorious, but mostly I felt tired. There is a special kind of exhaustion that comes from having to prove you own the thing everybody already knows is yours. The next day, Owen delivered another piece of the puzzle. The HOA bank ledger showed a payment of $685 to Falcon Ridge Recovery on the morning after the tow. Listed as emergency nuisance abatement, Vanessa had not only acted without a board vote, she had used association money to do it, then demanded another $400 from me before she would authorize release. Owen had obtained the ledger through a records request signed by 22 homeowners. The treasurer, a nervous accountant named Glenn Porter, had released it after realizing the payment carried Vanessa's signature alone. When Malcolm saw the entry, his voice changed. Until then, he had sounded like a lawyer handling a strong property dispute. Now he sounded like a hunter noticing movement in the tree line. "This is no longer just wrongful removal," he said. "This may be breach of fiduciary duty, conversion, and unauthorized use of association funds. If she knowingly altered the minutes to conceal the missing quorum, we may have another problem entirely." That afternoon, Vanessa called me directly. Her voice was softer than it had ever been on my porch. "Daniel," she said, "I believe emotions have gone the head of everyone here." I looked at the recording app on my phone and pressed the button. She offered to have the boat returned, waive the $400 charge, and remove the violation from my account. In exchange, I would withdraw my complaints, instruct Malcolm to stop contacting the board, and provide a written statement saying the incident had resulted from a misunderstanding. I let her finish. Then I asked, "Who approved the $685 payment?" Silence. She said the president had emergency discretion. I asked where that authority appeared in the bylaws. She said this was exactly the combative attitude she'd been trying to resolve. I almost laughed, because there it was again. The old trick of calling a question hostile when the answer is inconvenient. I told her all future communication would go through counsel. Before I hung up, she said, "You are turning your neighbors against each other over an old boat." "No, Vanessa," I said. "You took an old boat because you thought the neighbors would be too scared to stop you." I sent the recording to Malcolm. 3 days later, he filed a civil complaint naming both the HOA and Vanessa personally. Owen submitted a petition with enough signatures to force a special membership meeting. Marlene, Harold, the Bells, and 12 other residents agreed to speak. A local reporter learned about the federal inquiry and requested access to the meeting. Then, on the morning the notices went out, Vanessa made the mistake that finally convinced even her allies she had lost control. She called Falcon Ridge Recovery and asked Rick Danner whether the original tow authorization form could be replaced with a corrected version showing retroactive board approval. Rick's attorney had told him to record every conversation. By sundown, Malcolm had the audio. The board had a copy, and the county prosecutor's office had received a preservation request. A special meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 7. The federal representatives were due at Falcon Ridge that same afternoon, but after one quiet phone call with Malcolm, their plans changed. They would inspect the boat first, then come directly to Cedar Ridge, and Vanessa still believed the meeting would be nothing more than another room she could control. Thursday evening came with low gray clouds and the kind of damp coastal air that makes every wooden door stick in its frame. The Cedar Ridge Community Hall had 40 metal chairs, and by 6:45 every one of them was occupied, with another dozen residents standing along the back wall. Vanessa arrived in a navy blazer carrying 3 thick folders and wearing the same expression she had worn on my porch. Controlled, polished, certain that confidence could substitute for evidence. She sat at the center of the board table, arranged her papers into a perfect square, and called the meeting to order at exactly 7. Her first move was to limit public comments to 2 minutes and describe the evening as a discussion of storage aesthetics. Owen raised his hand before she finished the sentence. "The petition does not request a discussion of aesthetics," he said. "It requests a formal review of the president's unauthorized use of association funds and the removal of private property without a board vote." Vanessa told him he was out of order. Glenn Porter, the treasurer, surprised everyone by leaning toward his microphone and saying, "No, he is not." A silence moved through the room. It was small, but I watched Vanessa feel it. For months she had ruled because the people beside her preferred peace to conflict. Now one of those people had chosen conflict over complicity. Owen moved to amend the agenda. Another board member seconded him, and the motion passed 4 votes to 1. Vanessa was the one. Malcolm stood near the side wall with a rolling case full of documents. He had prepared packets for every household, plain language on the first page, supporting records behind it. When those packets moved through the room, the sound of paper turning seemed louder than the rain tapping the windows. Malcolm did not perform. Good lawyers rarely need to. He walked a room to the original covenant, the grandfathered approval, the missing quorum, the 2 versions of the meeting minutes, the $685 payment, and Vanessa's demand that I pay another $400 before my boat would be released. Then he played the recording of her call to Falcon Ridge Recovery. Her voice came through the small speaker clearly, asking whether the original authorization could be replaced by a corrected document showing board approval. Nobody moved. Even Vanessa seemed to stop breathing. When the recording ended, she leaned forward and said it had been taken out of context. Malcolm asked what context would make retroactive authorization appropriate. She stared at him, then shifted her attention to me. "This resident has created a spectacle," she said, "because he refuses to respect the standards that protect all of us." There it was, the last shelter of people who cannot defend what they did. An attack on the person who documented it. I stood, not because I had planned to, but because after weeks of lawyers and letters, I needed to say one thing in my own voice. I told the room I had lived there 11 years without a single violation. I told them the boat had been approved, screened, insured, and legally stored. I told them I had rebuilt it after retirement because I needed something useful to do with hands that had spent 2 decades fixing other people's problems. Then I looked at Vanessa and asked, "Who authorized you to enter my property at 2 in the morning, spend our neighbor's money, and take something you knew did not belong to you?" She opened her mouth, but before she could answer, the back door opened. 2 people stepped inside wearing dark blue Federal Service uniforms, rain still shining on their shoulders. The first was Commander Elise Harwood from the Maritime Heritage Legal Office. Beside her was a Coast Guard documentation officer named Lieutenant Mason Cole. They did not storm the room. They did not shout. They simply walked forward with the calm posture of people whose authority does not need decoration. Commander Harwood introduced herself, stated that they had inspected the Guardian patrol craft at Falcon Ridge Recovery, confirmed its federal documentation and preservation status, and identified concerns regarding its unauthorized relocation and conditional detention. Then she placed an official inquiry notice on the table in front of Vanessa. Ms. Ulf Crowell," she said, "our records identify you as the individual who initiated the removal. We are requesting that all related documents and communications be preserved and produced. Are you prepared to cooperate?" Vanessa looked at the notice, then around the room, as if searching for the version of Cedar Ridge where everyone still looked away. Nobody did. Her answer came out then. "I acted for community safety." Lieutenant Cole asked whether she had obtained a court order, law enforcement authorization, or consent from the registered custodian. Vanessa said the board had delegated enforcement discretion. Glenn spoke before she could continue. We did not. That ended it. Not with shouting, not with handcuffs, not with some dramatic confession, but with 3 quiet words from the man whose signature she had assumed would remain useful forever. A board member moved to suspend Vanessa's authority pending the civil case and all outside investigations. The vote was 4-1. Vanessa voted against it, gathered her folders, and left before public comments began. Nobody stopped her. 11 days later, she resigned, citing health and family obligations. The HOA's insurance carrier settled the lawsuit the following month. My boat was returned. My legal fees were paid. The violation was erased, and the association issued a written apology admitting that the tow had been unauthorized and funded without lawful approval. Falcon Ridge paid a regulatory penalty for failing to notify law enforcement and adopted new verification procedures. Rick Danner apologized to me personally. I believed him. He had been careless, but Vanessa had been deliberate, and there's a difference. The federal inquiry closed once the vessel was safely returned, though the notice remains part of the association's permanent records. On a cold Tuesday morning, a different tow company backed the Guardian onto my concrete pad. The trailer settled with one heavy metallic clunk, and for the first time in weeks the empty space beside my driveway looked right again. I put my hand against the faded hull. It was cold and rough beneath my palm, carrying old scratches from military docks and new dust from the storage yard. I expected triumph. What I felt was relief, followed by a sadness I had not anticipated. I had won back something that should never have required winning. Owen stood beside me holding 2 coffees and said, she thought nobody would make her prove anything. That was the whole story in one sentence. The new board repealed every amendment passed without a valid quorum, created a public enforcement log, and established a small legal consultation fund for residents facing disputed violations. Marlene kept her wheelchair ramp. Harold kept the birdhouse, which he repainted bright red just to test the limits of civic tolerance. The Bells had their fines refunded the following spring. I put the Guardian back in the water and took Owen fishing. We caught 1 undersized flounder, drank terrible coffee, and spent most of the day saying almost nothing. That silence felt better than applause. Vanessa did not lose because my boat had federal records, or because I had a lawyer who knew where to press. She lost because she believed ordinary people would remain ordinary as long as she frightened them one at a time. Maybe you think I went too far by bringing federal officials, lawyers, reporters, and the entire neighborhood into a dispute over an old boat. Maybe you think returning it and accepting her first offer would have been the neighborly thing to do. I still believe peace purchased with silence is only permission wearing a friendly face. Tell me where you stand. Was this accountability? Or did I turn a petty HOA dispute into something bigger than it needed to be? Share your own neighborhood story below. Tell me who was right. And if someone in your community has ever confused a title with unlimited power, send this story to them before they learn that lesson the expensive way.